we've got quite a few things to get through today. Just to kick off, we are going to be recording this because there's a number of people that couldn't join, so it'll just be able to capture for them. So if anybody objects to that, then just be careful you don't say anything. If you have got questions, probably just easiest, we're going to put people on mute for now, but just to put things in chat. Once I've finished sort of briefly going through these slides, then we'll pick up the chat message and I'll try and, I've got somebody in the room next to me and we'll try and get through those points. If there's things we can't answer, we'll come back to those. We'll come back later and try and get a general response about that. But hopefully we can answer most things as we go along. I say that now, but you'll probably throw me. So hopefully we're sharing the slides and people can see them. Yeah, good. That's all going well. So we're here today, just in case you're in the wrong meeting, we're here today to talk about a strategy development framework really around advanced materials innovation. And this is really a pre-tender meeting, just to give a little bit more detail from what we announced just before the Christmas break, and to get feedback from you so that we can just fold that into any things that we may have missed in the tender documentation before we proceed that in the coming week. So as I said, I'm David Knowles, so I'm the CEO here at Henry Royce Institute, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of background to where this is coming from. So obviously, you know, I sit here in Henry Royce. We focus in the institute. We focus very much on advanced materials, and it's really important for us to drive what the strategy is and understand what the strategy is around the materials research and innovation and how that's translating into national needs and impact. So a compelling reason for developing a strategy is to understand and actually promote advanced materials in the UK and demonstrate what that value is. So if we just look at this slide, to sort of look at what the drivers are, why we should be doing advanced materials research and the areas that it underpins, we can pick any number of these. But if you look at the UK's ambitions around transition to net zero, if you look around the transformation to digital, if you look about circular economy and actually sustainable use of our resources, or health or sustainable manufacture, really at the core and the bottom of all those, underpins them all, is advanced materials and advanced materials innovation in that regard. Now, if we look at it, that's been recognised by government. It's been fantastic. They, you know, in the research and UK research and innovation strategy, they've pulled out advanced materials and manufacturing as one of the key 7 technologies. But notwithstanding that, there isn't a strategy around that. So the whole point and the whole background to what we're trying to do here is actually move the dial on this and actually move towards a strategy which helps the research, but more importantly, actually the translation of that research. So we're getting it into society and we're having real commercial and economic impact across the UK. So that's a little bit of the background. Just to add to that, of course, you know, traditionally, we've always had these sectors, and we can talk about the aerospace, the automotive, digital, renewable energy, nuclear. You know, those sectors have all existed and they've all got very strong groups that support them. Materials underpins a lot of those areas, or all of those areas, but materials itself hasn't got its own sector. And this is why it's so important that strategy and this strategy gets evolved and developed. And that's the whole purpose for calling you all here today. And this is very much just the start of a process in that regard. It is going to take time to work this through. Okay, so I just wanted to, before I get into the detail around the tender, I do want to set the scene around what we're aiming to do here in a little bit more detail. So the first point, which I've already stressed, is that the focus here is very much on innovation and technology translation. And that's a really important point to bring out, and just keep that in mind as we're going through this. So the ambition is for us ultimately to develop a comprehensive advanced materials innovation strategy. And that's not just a research strategy. Research will be in there, but it's not just about research. It's very much about that translation piece. And we're looking for this strategy to actually have something like a 10 to 20 year horizon. That's not to say all the output's going to occur in that 10 to 20 years. We've got a lot we need to do in the coming 5 to 10 years, but it's got to have that long-term focus and a trajectory for where we need to go in terms of our research and innovation activities. A part of this, however, is also to look back and understand the big picture. So it's very much top down, and to start to think a little bit about what the priority should be in the areas that we should be looking in the early stage research. So it's not saying we're not going to look at the research. I think we are going to focus on the research, but it's going to be top down. But again, the stress is that's going to direct that activity and how that pulls through and how it pulls through to being used and exploited. The other thing, of course, that we're looking to do is actually give real clarity to the investment community. And investment community, I mean here, government, industry, and other venture capital or private equity investments, because we are looking to actually de-risk the investment opportunities here and secure funding and the flow of funding into this translational research activity. So it's really looking to unlock those opportunities by giving clarity about the direction of travel for the innovation and research areas. And the other point I want to bring out is this isn't simple. People have looked at this before. There are groups, and there is a lot of historical information which anyone that's getting involved with this will need to pull onto, things like the Advanced Materials Leadership Council. But it really has got caught up in a number of different areas before, such as it's got really caught up in sectors, for instance, before, and decoupling those from some of the more, I guess the word is pervasive aspects, where materials has common threads into lots of different sectors, has always proved quite difficult. And that's something that we will need to unpick. And that's why I think it's very important that this is going to be looked at with a top-down perspective in that regard. So what we're talking about today is not developing the strategy in detail itself. We're talking here very much about developing the framework. So what it's going to look like, what pieces of the puzzle we need. And hence, as we move forward into the detail, we've got that framework set from the start and we're heading in the right direction, and everyone understands what the common purpose is and what the pieces are and how they fit together. Because ultimately, I think as we develop the strategy, there will be a number of parties involved. And so it will be the interfaces between the output from those parties and how it comes together into a coherent document, and focus will be key. Right. So the overriding ambition here then is to stimulate innovation in advanced materials. It's very much around stimulating also that scale up in the manufacturing process. We can't think about materials, the research element, without thinking about, well, how does that translate? How does that scale up? How does that become a reality in terms of its use and how it's employed across a whole range of industrial sectors? It's also about broadening and developing capability in the UK. We're strong in some areas of research, but there's huge opportunities that perhaps we haven't exploited so much, or areas we do need to sort of rekindle and strengthen again. That skill force, of course, underpins that. It's no good us talking about technology if we haven't got the skilled people to fill the gap, because hopefully this will expand the activities and research substantially. There's other factors that are going to come into play as well, which is really important, which is why I think we need this foresight, and it's critical to strategy. We need to understand the context from a regulatory and also a societal aspect and how that fits in, or how we may need to move the dial on that, how we may need to socialize some of these activities and get on the front foot with them. And of course, it's also about maximizing the benefit to the UK through international engagement and how we can make that work better for us in that regard. Just before then we get on to any more of the detail, I think it's important to stress the role for Royce in this. So Henry Royce Institute was established to develop and capitalise on the UK's world-leading, its excellence or recognised excellence in advanced materials research. In that regard, I'm sat here, if you like, as a sponsor of this activity rather than the owner in many ways of this activity. So the whole research community is going to own this strategy, and it's really important that everyone feels that they're engaged, and you will see that a community element and broad engagement is actually key for this going all the way through. As Royce, I'm just trying to move things forward on this, and so acting, if you like, as a conduit and a convener in this process, but not owning it. And that's an important point to bring out. We're sponsored ultimately by the government down through BEIS and through UKRI and EPSRC. And it's a remit of feeding information back into them as well as bodies that helps in that regard. Just a little bit more background about, the policy space and where we've come in here. I've already talked about the fact that the UK innovation strategy has identified materials and manufacturing as one of the key elements of the strategy, one of those key 7 technologies. So that's key. We've done that piece. Following on from that, in last year, there was the critical minerals strategy, which was developed, which some people may have seen. That very much focused on things like security, supply, and resilience in that regard, and focused on that specific element. What it didn't do was it didn't look at the much broader strategy around materials. So it was quite focused in that regard. We did have a body at BEIS, an advanced materials group, that were helping and looking at this, and I'll come to, they did have a call for evidence, and I'll come to that on the next slide, but that didn't evolve into a strategy, so that stalled, if you like, at that stage. But what we've managed to do to rekindle it, some people may have seen that we had Grant Shapps came through quite recently to announce funding coming into Royce at the advanced materials level. And at that point, we sort of really emphasize that it's great you're putting this funding in from a government level into advanced materials research, but by the way, did you know that you've disbanded this group that's really going to help drive the strategy? So we use that as a little bit of a lever really to rekindle this activity, and it's really great that they're coming on board and they're very keen to see this strategy coming through. They just want the community to own it. It's not going to be driven by government, it's going to be driven by us as a group in that regard. But we have got some background, and people may have seen, and I suspect a number of people on this call actually contributed for the BEIS Advanced Material Call for Evidence. So this was the precursor to development of the strategy, and we will still go back and reach into that because there was a lot of really good information that went into that, so it won't be wasted. But it won't flow through the group that actually commissioned that activity. But the things that came out of them are going to be key to the strategy. One of them key things that came out was the challenge that we've got is around commercializing ideas. So, for instance, it really highlighted that it's that translation piece which is key and something we've got to focus on. And it did talk about the funding gaps in support and enabling environments for the supply chain, that late stage development. So there's already some real nuggets in there which we'll draw on. And there are lots of other pieces of work that have been done historically that we can draw on as well in that regard. So there's quite a lot on those slides. Apologies for that, but it was just to set the scene and provide a little bit of background. We come into more detail about what we're actually wanting to do now. We're developing this around a 2-stage strategy. Today, I'm going to be talking much more about stage 1. And that's around the development of the framework. So it's the structure on which we're going to build the strategy, essentially, and getting that right. So what we're looking for here is to bring in resource. I guess we're calling it seeking a contractor, but it's really somebody that's got that sort of insight to think about how a strategy should develop, think outside the box about what the framework should look like for a strategy around advanced materials innovation. So we will be able to call on historical approaches, but we are looking to stand back and say, well, hold on, what's going to work for us as a discipline, a key discipline, which translates across a wide number of sectors, and what's the best way to present that and collect that evidence. In doing this, I guess we will need an element of engagement. So we're not going to just sit back in our ivory tower we don't want the contract to do that and sort of come up with a way of producing this framework. We really want them to engage with a broad spectrum of the community. So this isn't about that going out and having vast conversations with people, but it's selecting a representative group across the community and actually maybe having a workshop or small groups and discussions to sort of saying, well, testing and stress testing the framework and how that may evolve. And it's really getting buy-in from the broad community. Yes, this is the way we want this to go forward. Of course, it won't work for everybody, so there will be an element of consensus here, and there'll be some compromises. but it's important that we're taking the vast majority of industry and academia in particular along in this journey, and they're all comfortable with the way it's going to look in that regard. So this first sort of stage is going to set that structure for the strategy. We're not expecting ultimately at the end of this first stage to have a long document. It may be a little bit longer than 6,000 to 8,000 words. Probably going to be illustrated a lot by schematics and diagrams, because it's got to be something that's easily digestible and something that's easy to understand and easy to present in that regard. But there may be a little bit of background and analysis work that's done as part of that. There'll certainly be a bit of homework and looking at previous history, I think, and work that's taken place and what's available. But it's really just to help shape it. We don't want to go into huge detail at this stage. So it's not a huge literature review, for instance, in that regard. So that first stage then is what I've been talking about to date has been what I would call phase one. So phase one is determining a methodology or framework, as I'll call it, for the delivery of an impactful strategy. So something that's really going to turn into something which is going to be used and endure through the community. Phase two of stage one is to then sort of move that to what we would call a launch event. So what we want to do then is actually get broad, having a key sort of date set, most likely around Westminster with a launch event, to say, right, we've done all this pre-work, here's what the strategy framework is going to look like. I guess socialize that then to a wider group of influential individuals. So it's probably going to have senior industry engagement and senior engagement maybe across research technology organizations, to get those groups really bought in to what will then be the meat of the activity over the coming, I guess, 3 to 4 months, where we actually write the strategy and we evolve the strategy in earnest. So stage two, which isn't part of this tender, but obviously it's the really interesting bit, it's the bit that we want to get to, is actually the formation of the generation of the strategy. So that's going to involve a lot of activities. So we will then need to form necessary working groups. We will need to get the right sponsors and advocates on board, because we're going to have to sort of promote and talk about the work that's taking place here. We probably will have to commission other activities. I expect multiple parties will be involved in development ultimately of the strategy in detail, because we'll need to pull in different sorts of areas of expertise. And we're probably likely to involve commissioning other areas such as investment reviews. And then we will end up drawing that together into that overall arching strategy report and recommendations. So what we're looking to do, it depends a little bit on how we may link into policy, but ultimately this will be something that then we have discussions with different funding parties, etc. with. And really the strategy's the starting point at the end of the day. There'll still be a lot to do after that. But this first stage is around that framework, which then leads into this stage two activity. So just in terms of timelines and milestones, put them up here. They are still a little bit subject to change, but we do need to move with pace on this. If we've got the ear of ministers at the moment. If we sit on this too long, we'll lose that and we'll lose the enthusiasm. So we've got the webinar today, which is an introduction to the people here, and hopefully also there'll be a wider group who want to be engaged. We're looking to go out with a formal tender by at the latest the 18th of January. If we don't have a lot of feedback today and there's not a lot of changes to make, I may be able to get that out sooner, but that will be the latest date that it gets posted. But then the timeline's quite tight. We really want the tenders responded to by early morning on the 27th of January. So that really is not giving me a huge amount of time, but we're not looking for a lot of detail in that tender submission. We're then going to review those over the next week or so and appoint a contractor very quickly. And then we see that there's a set of planning meetings, probably in activities taking place through February. But ultimately, I'm looking for a draft report coming sort of in that third week of March, because we're looking to launch the framework with an event in Westminster in around the 20th of April. Actually, I think that date's almost fixed and set in stone now. So that's going to determine, what we need to have by that date. And then launch for the stage 2, if you like, tender will come probably a week after that. Now, obviously, the intention is that people that are involved in very much in this stage, we hope that they would carry through into that subsequent stage. But as I said earlier, I suspect we will need a lot more parties involved at that point. And it will then, it will be a little bit open about what that tender looks like and how we're going to have to frame that. It may be a set of small tenders actually around activities, or maybe one overarching tender. That's still to be determined. And just to give you for full sort of clarity, in terms of looking at the evaluation of this tender stage for this framework activity, we're obviously going to place most of the emphasis on people understanding the brief, understanding the methodology and what we're going to do, and actually how they're presenting that with some clarity. So for me, the most important thing is going to be, do the people that are going to undertake this work really understand what we're trying to do? And probably the next most important thing is, have they got a bit of a track record? Have they got the understanding and capability to present that? Have those engagements, have the right connections, and build a strategy, a framework for that strategy that looks acceptable to the wider community.
And if there's a question.
Okay.
Nikki's asking, just to confirm, this is a tender to develop the strategy framework, not the strategy
Yes,
itself.
absolutely. So I can't stress that enough. So this is very much what I would call a sprint project. I don't like probably overusing that word a little bit at the moment, but it's to move to this framework to say, this is what the strategy will look like. This is how it will be framed. We may put a little bit of detail in it at a very, very high level. And we anticipate that it will be a top-down strategy. So we'll be looking at national needs and reaching down, but we'll have to think about, how it links then into sectors, how it links into disciplines, how it links into capabilities in that regard. And then we'll have to put in the second stage is when we put the meat on the bone, and we add the real detail in that regard, and the evidence, etc., and come up with real recommendations. The only other thing I wanted to say on the proposal evaluation, of course, value for money is included in there, but it's not the overriding thing. In many ways, we're time limited on this, so that will limit really in many ways some of the aspects around costs and then the number of people that we can deploy on it. And there's only so many people that can work on this when you think about what we're trying to produce in terms of a framework in that regard. So that's what we're intending to put out. That's the end of my slides. I'll stop sharing now. And although we've got a more time put aside, I'm really here for as long as needed in terms of any questions or clarifications that you may need. So if you want to put them up on the chat, or I think you can unmute people who are prepared to ask, that's fine. It just depends whether anyone's a little bit shy or not and wanted to speak. I'm happy to take questions now. What is the scope of materials? What is scope of materials participants? What do you mean in that regard, Rob? Sorry, I don't quite understand.
I was wondering who is there a boundary to the strategy framework, to the strategy for materials in the UK? What's in, what's out? Maybe there's some obvious things that are in, but what's on the edge?
So it's advanced materials, right? So point one is, what is an advanced material? That's quite difficult, isn't it? So what we're defining in this, and we've put it into the tender strategies, advanced materials in our mind is where we've added significant value to a material. So what we're not doing here is we're not looking at basic commodity activity. So this isn't around bulk chemicals. It's not around, I would call, basic steel. But where we're modifying, and we've got things like structural steels or high strength steels, those are advanced materials. So it's actually pretty broad scope, Rob. It's trying to cover, or where we've got functionality. So where we've taken things and turned them into devices, or we've got layered structures, or we've got coatings. They all come, in my mind, under advanced materials because we're adding considerable value, if you like, to the underlying chemistry. But one of the challenges is going to be putting a bit of a boundary around that. But it is quite open at the moment. I think one of the problems we've got is that government talk a lot about advanced material, but I don't think they necessarily understand what, or they're not clear on what advanced materials are. And I think as a community, we could argue about that till the cows come home. But at the end of the day, it's about, we think it's about that added value. And that's the thing that we want to hone in on. And
in terms of the participants, David, is that, I mean, you can imagine industry, sure, academia, yes, government agencies, perhaps. Are there other types of bodies or participation that needs to be involved, or is there a flavor that you want, I don't know, industrial led or academia led strategy?
Well, it's not necessarily what I want to a certain extent. I guess to a part of it is we've got to engage with those people to understand what's needed there. I see this having a strong industry lead, because if you remember or recall a major part of this is about the technology translation. So we've got to understand why we've got fantastic research going on in the UK, but we're not actually fantastic at innovating that materials activity. So what we've got to do is bring the right people into the room, the right stakeholders, to sort of unpick that and see what we need to do to change that. So I think there's a strong role in there for industry. I think, and that's not just large industry, that's a lot around mid caps, the industries that really are the powerhouse of the UK. What do they need? What do they need to draw through? Obviously, we need to influence government, and so I think they'll be listening in this, not actively participating. The RTOs will have a key role to play, and input. I am really interested on the side about the investor community as well, and what they're, why aren't they investing in advanced materials as much as perhaps they should be? What would de-risk it, and what would change things for them? So I think that's an important lens for us to consider. It's not all about big industry. It is about, is about those innovations and, and how we're helping those and how we're supporting the translation of those. Does that answer the question a bit, Rob?
Very good. Thank you, David.
Okay. Is there a working? No, there isn't a working classification of advancement. Well, there are a number of people who have posed it, Nikki. I would get back to that point that I said. We're actually classifying it. I mean, it may be that the people come into the room are very happy to come up with their own definition, and I think we're more than willing to listen to that. At the moment, we're defining it as where we've added considerable value, if you like, to those basic chemicals, essentially, or elements. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Nikki. And sorry, it's a bit evasive, but I feel that we could spend half an hour talking about what an advanced material is and probably not answer the question here. I mean, I think, a really good example of that is plastics and packaging. People look at packaging on food and say that's not a high value or an advanced material. Actually, if you look at what's gone into a lot of that packaging, layered structures, etc., it's incredibly advanced. And they've added huge value to it. So there's a lot of elements like that which we shouldn't ignore. And I think, we need to make sure that they're captured, because otherwise we're doing disservice to what the materials community, the research and innovation, where it can add real value.
Yeah, this is really helpful. Thank you very much. I mean, basically, because when you develop a strategy framework, you need to know how sort of granular it needs to go down. And that's why it was the question. So, yeah. It is difficult to know where to stop with some of this. But I mean, what would be a good example? I'll tell you, I think what would be a good example. If you were talking about bulk concrete, I don't think that's part of an advanced material strategy. If you're starting to look about decarbonising cement industry and you're looking at zero carbon concrete or something like that, that's then an advanced material strategy, because you're adding considerable value or you're changing something which is going to make a huge difference to that in terms of how society is going to perceive it. So those, if that's a really crude distinction, that's an area that we would see as, carbon-free concrete would be an advanced material in our regard, because you've changed things dramatically and you've added real value, not necessarily monetary, but certainly societal. Yeah, that's a good. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I mean, my question also was around, because if there is a classification, it may impact, for example, the different, because you talked specifically about the commercialization of these materials. So the supply chains around them are quite important. So, yes, if you have some sort of, for better or worse terms, classification of that, it will give you more insight about what exactly you need to put in place to make the supply chain sustainable, I think, and useful for the UK.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, the supply chain is key in this, which comes back a little bit, I mean, to the point I was trying to get to, Rob. We do need to make sure the supply chain's engaged. This has been one of the problems with materials, as far as I think we found, a lot of the time things are done in isolation without either people understanding what's feeding into that innovation, out from that innovation, how it's being applied in that regard. No one in materials can work in isolation. That's the problem. Given the time frame, do you expect the stakeholder engagement framework stage is likely to flow through? No, it's not. It's right. I'm going to please decouple this from being about Royce Partners. This is a national activity. So what I would hope is that the framework development stage, we would engage a broad group of the community. I do not expect us to engage everybody. That would be impossible. What I want to do is make sure that it's a framework which the supply chain, industry, academia, and the RTOs are all sort of aligned with, really, and they agree, and there's an element of consensus in there. Then what the point is, we will then socialize that more widely, but hopefully everyone will sort of understand that, you know, that's been developed with a representative group at that stage. This is not about flowing out through the Royce Institute University Partners, no, in that regard at all. Is there a scope for the maturity levels of those advanced materials when we develop a strategy framework? Do you want to expand on that point, really? Why that's important?
Oh, hi, David. I don't know if you can hear me or see me.
I hear you,
yeah,
can't see you. But,
yeah, so I was just thinking, right, when we create a framework or a strategy for a framework, it's, you know, coming back to the previous question about the supply chain and the maturity of the supply chain. So you need to develop a framework, probably, you know, with a line of sight of this. So hence my question about the maturity levels of these advanced materials, because some of them could be very much in academia. So if we think of what might be the framework for the UK government to take these forward, we have to think in what time scale and the uses of these materials across, you know, those big transformational things they are going to do. So hence, I was just thinking aloud, and hence asked the question about how we tie the maturity levels, because that's the forward-looking element further down the path, but you're creating a framework to basically implement these advanced materials moving forward.
Yeah, okay. So I think this is why, you know, I think the consensus from people I've been talking to today has been very much that they're interested in looking at this from a top down, because I think the danger we've got is we talk about a material being mature, but a material can be quite mature, but from a manufacturing perspective, that can be very immature. It can be very early stage. So, you know, this whole idea of, you know, maturity levels, you know, means different things to different people. And often are you providing a material which fits into an existing supply chain? Or are you providing something that it's going to have to have a completely new supply chain? So I think we're really focused here on, innovation. And I guess I'll come back to that point completely. It's about, what are the gaps? Why aren't we translating some of these? Now, there will be some things that we should be able to translate quickly because there's existing infrastructure in place and we're doing relatively modest modification. But there are other things which may need a huge change in infrastructure. Now, if it needs a huge change in infrastructure, that's a high risk, because you know, you've got to introduce that infrastructure and you know, sort of get the funding to do that, and before you've even, you know, made a product. And that's probably a reflection on, you know, where some of the investment community is coming from. So I think we will need to consider that, and there will be a portfolio of activities, some stuff that within the strategy you'll say, well, hold on, this is stuff that should be pulled through in the next 5 to 10 years. But historically, you know, it takes 20 years to commercialize a material. You know, that's something we've got to change. And that, you know, that's what we're looking to do here. So we're looking to pull through the good ideas. It's important that we see new things further down the track, and so we're not trying to undermine that activity at all. But I think we're just trying to here recognize that we do need to invest right across that chain from early discovery through to application. And perhaps that middle piece hasn't had the attention that it needs to really let advanced materials shine.
Yeah, thank you. I think makes sense.
Okay, there's a lot more questions. I'm trying to work out what's the next one on my list. Are there activities in ISO TC 229 regarding the development of terminology? I don't know, Stephanie. So if you've got some comments on that, I would welcome them. I don't know actually around that at all. Would improving overall life cycle costing for specific application also be considered adding value? Yeah, I mean in a broad view, that the circularity piece is absolutely critical. So I don't think we can develop any material in isolation now without thinking about how we go around unmaking it as well as making it. And so that will be, so I would say that if you've got an existing material and there's a way of looking at a way of recovering that and bringing that round into the system, that's an advanced materials innovation. Because you're making that then a sustainable source, for want of a better word. So yes, I think that's very much in scope. What is the overall budget available, and how many projects are going to be funded? What do you mean by how many projects are going to be funded? Maybe you can answer that. Obviously, at the moment, we're funding this tender for this activity into stage 2. It's not quite clear how many sub-projects, I guess, there will be. That will be decided as part of this. The value of the first part, I think, is largely going to be determined by the timeline. So given that we need to complete it in a couple of months, I think if you think about having a small number of people working on that, we put in place a budget that would support that. So, I don't have concerns around the budget in that regard. I'm not expecting people to have 20 people working on this over the next 2 months. I expect it to be a small group.
Thank you.
Okay. Rob, come back to you. You mentioned policy in your presentation. Do you expect an element of what good relevant industrial innovation policy looks like? I don't think so at this first stage, Rob, but ultimately, I think the strategy, it will need to feed into shaping policy, right? Undoubtedly. So I think input to that is going to be critical in that regard. How that's going to evolve, I don't think I've got a clear view on that or opinion on that. I'd be quite happy. I don't know if other people, there's various other people that have got a stake in this in the room, if they've got anything they want to comment, but I see policy as critical in this. I think the strategy, if we all get behind it and we all believe in it, should shape the policy and drive the policy. And if it hasn't, I don't think the strategy is right. Okay. Any other questions or comments? There are a few other people that are on the call who have been involved in helping pull elements of the tender together. If they want to, feel free. If they want to add something they feel I've missed at this stage.
Will be attended by
Emma, sorry, I didn't see your hand. I can see it now.
No, that's fine. Thanks very much, David. It seems like a really sensible approach, and I'm certainly excited by the opportunity. I was wondering if you've given much thought to the role of devolved nations in the framework and how you would like them to be considered.
Well, I haven't devolved them, I guess. At the moment, they're all,
Okay.
Everyone's included. So I'm looking at this very much as a UK-wide activity. I think in many ways, you could shape this for almost any country in that regard. I think what we're looking at, I mean, I don't think, well, a lot of the challenges the UK have got, you could probably translate to a number of certainly of the other developed countries in that regard. So I think there is an element of looking at this at a national lens. But coming to your point, Emma, which opens an interesting one, obviously there's a huge global opportunity here. So one of the things we do need to do is take our blinkers off a little bit and not just think, okay, this is what the UK needs. We do need to think about this is what's needed on a world stage. And there are great opportunities around advanced materials and how we can either look at developing technology which can be applied elsewhere, or actually developing technology which can be applied in the UK and then translated elsewhere. So whether that's in terms of IP and licensing development or in terms of growing a manufacturing base in the UK, depends on the different areas and activities. But thanks for the question, because I think that global lens is important. There is a danger of making this too parochial if we're not careful. It's about generating, value for the UK, obviously, at the end of the day, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be for global, with that sort of global view and perspective.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think there was a comment from, did you have a comment that you wanted,
I was just,
Judith, on this
just
side?
to reiterate that we'll circulate the full tender document with all details of budget, etc.
Yes, so the tender document will go out in the next, well, definitely by the 18th. We may circulate that slightly ahead of that if we don't get, if there are no more searching questions or things that we have to consider. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions or hands. If you do think of something specifically, do send the email into the info@royce.ac.uk address, the same one which you've seen online, and we'll pick those up. And if they're generic questions, we'll make sure we either capture that in the tender or we add it to some of the responses. Obviously, we'll put this recording up on online so other people can access it, or you can go back and look at that some detail if you want. But if that's the end of the questions, I think we can call it a day there. I'm just going to check whether nothing else has come in. Nope. Okay, well, thanks everyone for your time. I'm hoping this is going to be really successful going forward. And I wanted to stress again, what's important is, yes, we will ultimately have to make some decisions of who we go through in this initial stage, but I think this is going to be much more open as we move into stage 2, and we do need a diverse group of people with different backgrounds, different perspectives engaging. So even if that you're not successful, if you like, for stage 1, there may be a lot of opportunities, and we hope there'll be a lot of opportunities in stage 2 in that regard. Okay, thanks very much, everyone, and we'll stop there. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and we look forward to hearing from you.